Hello, everyone. Welcome to Encore Learning. I guess you saw, if you got in earlier, you saw we're in pre-production mode, trying to set things up, but apologize for that. Anyway, today we're going to talk about the update on Puerto Rico and the long road to recovery, especially regarding their power systems, um, and how it relates to the United States. Our speaker, Eric Ackerman, went to the island multiple times before and after the hurricanes, examined the problems. He provided strategic advice to Puerto Rico, and using his experience, he will discuss and analyze the challenges of rebuilding the electric grid in Puerto Rico and how it relates to our power problems in the United States. And tell you a little bit about the speaker, Eric Ackerman is a former chief strategist at the Edison Electric Institute for Retail Energy Delivery, providing national leadership on issues involving adaptive business strategy and alternative regulation. He is an expert on business and regulatory policy issues associated with grid modernization, the growth of distributed energy at scale, and the changing role of utilities in the market. What I'm trying to say is that he knows a lot about electric grids. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and Eric, you can start your presentation.
Okay. Let me. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I trust the audience can then. Well, good afternoon. Good to be with you. My name is Eric Ackerman. This is my first introduction to Encore, but I think I likely, after I give my presentation, the next time I am with Encore, I may be on the other side of the speaking podium, as it were. I think this is looks like a great program, and I'm maybe very interested in joining you in future audiences. But let me proceed. Advance my slides. What's wrong here? There we go. So I am retired from the investor-owned electric utility industry. I was the director of alternative regulation with EEI, the Edison Electric Institute, retired at the end of 2016. And I won't go over, rehash what the descriptors that Harry gave you. I did know something about regulation. And while I was at EEI, I had participated in this Rutgers University Center for Research in Regulated Industries, and I'd met a gentleman from Puerto Rico who was with the Institute for Competitive and Sustainable Economy in Puerto Rico, a nonprofit advocacy group. And after I retired, I was introduced to him and suggested that I could help him, and indeed I could, and I supported ICSA with regulatory strategy for several years before the storm and after the storm. And so it's based on that experience that I'm speaking to you today. And the perspectives I'm giving you are purely my own. And I'm approaching Puerto Rico as a case study. We don't live in Puerto Rico. Why is any of this relevant to us? Well, the grid, the electric utility system that we all rely on, and by the way, I think we've learned in the last year, living in the quarantine mode, we've learned to rely on the grid ever more than we did. All the stuff that we do on the computer, of course, wouldn't be possible if we didn't have a grid that was energized and up and running. And so we've come to really rely on it, personally, and our economy. The businesses that have learned to continue to function online, the electric supply is ever more critical to our way of life. So the changes that are going on in the grid are generic. They affect, they certainly are present and happening in the lower 48, not just in Puerto Rico. So we can, I put this talk together to kind of look at what happened in Puerto Rico as a case study. So we can talk a little bit about the critical role that electricity plays in society. That clearly was evident in what happened in Puerto Rico after they lost power. The need for a new kind of power. There is, from an engineering point of view, there is change afoot in the industry because of this transition from central station power to distributed power. And I'll talk a little more about that as we get into it. The other thing that the Puerto Rican experience really demonstrates is that it's not just the grid, stupid. There are a whole series of institutions that are part of how we supply power to society, and they're very important, and they've been somewhat dysfunctional in Puerto Rico. So in the end, I think given the changes that are afoot, and we have more changes coming because of climate change, we need to decarbonize the system, et cetera. There are some large questions raised that as active citizens, I think it's good for us to think about. And I tried to frame some of these at the very end of my talk, so maybe we can have some discussion about that. So let me proceed. So I've put about 60 minutes worth of talk here together in roughly this kind of a logical flow. It is, of course, the storms that put Puerto Rico on the map, or that dominated the front page in 2017. So we'll talk about the storms, of course, and rebuilding the grid. But then we'll talk a little bit about their financial issues, because the road to recovery is about a lot more than just rebuilding the electric grid. It's about restoring their financial health. And we'll get into the topic of institutional transformation. There are a number of key institutions in Puerto Rico that were not working. Starting with the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, which is a state-owned utility. We would call it a municipal utility, which had a long history of poor performance. And so we'll talk about, and part of a key role for me in giving this regulatory strategy to my client was how to stand up. They have a regulatory bureau, a regulatory commission now, but they only recently got it. It only recently was authorized in about 2014. So they've had a lot of issues with how to get their regulator up and running, and how to get the utility to pay attention to the regulator. Utility wasn't used to being regulated and resisted. To this day resist. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Also, we've had a history of restructuring in the lower 48. We have, if you've been reading the newspapers at all since the 1990s, late 90s, you know that we have, in a lot of states, we have implemented what's called retail choice. We have unbundled these utilities that were originally vertically integrated. We did that because we thought market competition would bring a lot of benefits. So there's been a lot of market restructuring that's going on in the lower 48. And in Puerto Rico's case, so they have a utility that has been dysfunctional for a long time. Nobody likes the utility. That's the first thing I learned when I started working in Puerto Rico. And all these examples in the lower 48 of new restructuring are appealing. They want to do it all, but of course Puerto Rico is an island, and it's a relatively small system by U.S. standards, and so I think it doesn't follow that everything that we've done in the lower 48 is directly transferable. So there's some questions about how and how fully to restructure the market. So I'll allude to that a little bit. And then I'll come back to this issue about developing effective regulatory oversight. What are the challenges for the Commission in trying to be an effective regulator? And I will show you some examples of how big the challenge is. So, and then we'll end up with some questions for discussion. So I hope we will have some questions. I told my colleagues here at Encore at the beginning, if we don't have any questions, that's a sign you're not engaged. It doesn't make sense to you, or you're not interested or whatever. So I hope you have a lot of questions. So PREPA, this is the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. They were created in about 1941 to begin to electrify the island. And this date reminds me of something. You know, at EEI, we had a library that had a quotation on the as you walked in. It was a quote taken from somebody in Kentucky, probably a hillbilly, up in the mountain somewhere, that something he said in church in, I think it was 1942. And the quote went like this, and this of course is at a time when we are electrifying the US, and particularly the country and the Tennessee Valley and places that had not gotten electricity yet. He said, brothers and sisters, I want to tell you the two greatest things in life. The first is having God in your heart. And the second is having electricity in your house. The point being that electricity, we today, who have always had electricity, don't appreciate it. But it was a social revolution. It has transformed our society and continues to. All right. So PREPA was originally, part of that wave of modernization, and I'm sure they were a hero. They were well thought of in the early days. They were an engine of progress, but they had no regulatory oversight from the beginning, and as a result, I think they were subject to political influence all the time. And one of the lessons here is that that's not a good prescription for public service. So by the end, in modern times, but right before the storms, I'd say they had excessive feather bedding. They had, for a utility that was very small by US standards, they had about 4 times the number of employees of a comparably sized utility in the US. They had corruption. I was in the country in 2018 for a big so-called public collaborative to try to build public consensus about the way forward. And I was taking an Uber one evening back to my hotel, and I mentioned to the driver why I was in town, and she volunteered. She said, "Oh, my ex-husband was a senior executive in the utility, and I can tell you, every time they bought anything, they always padded the cost and skimmed off the top." So utility had a long history of corruption. They had lost, notwithstanding they had too many people, they had lost some of the right people, the people that most technically trained. So that I think they to this day suffer some key technical people. And as a result, partly as a result of that, they didn't maintain the system very well. Systems worn out, particularly the generating stations were worn out. And as we will talk further when we talk about the financial problems, because of this excessive government influence, in the from 2010 to 2011, 2012, 2013, oil prices were skyrocketing in world oil markets. And this is a system that was largely oil fired. So they burn a lot of oil. So when the price of oil goes up, their input costs are going up. You got to pay that. And what do? You should pass that cost along into consumers and rates. That's what we do everywhere else in the industry. Well, in Puerto Rico, the government leaned on the utility and told them didn't want to let them raise rates because, of course, it's unpopular to raise rates. But how did they make up the difference? They borrowed money, believe it or not. They sold bonds to cover these short-term cost increases. So that was the genesis, a big part of the genesis of their excessive debt problems. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of the story. The point is that before the storms hit, they were already, the system was sort of already on its last legs and a very poor performance, and nobody liked them there. So what could get worse? Could it get worse? Yes, it could get worse. We had these storms, September of 2017, two distinct storms. The first one was technically a little bit stronger, a category 5, which is, I can't read my slides completely here, but let me go back. Sorry. Sustained winds above 157 miles per hour. You know, that is intense. The stuff comes apart in a hurry when you got winds like that. So they had that event, and then they had a second event a couple of days later. The result was that large portions of the PREPA utility system, both the distribution system and the transmission system, were destroyed. Substations were underwater. The transmission towers, as we'll talk about in a minute, a lot of them were blown down. It was a huge mess, and so that was what happened. Here's a NASA satellite image of Puerto Rico on a good night, or a good day, I guess good night. The grid is energized, everything's normal, and you can see where the lightest part of this is where the people are. So that very light stuff at the northeast part of the island, that's San Juan, the highest population centers. So here, right after the storm, look, lights out pretty much across the island. A few little spots of light around San Juan, which I think must reflect that there were some backup generators available to some lucky people. But for the most part, the grid went quiet, and it stayed quiet for months and months and months. Here we've got some photos, some images that were taken at the time, and you can see flooding, and you see these distribution poles that have just been completely knocked over and buildings completely destroyed. I was down there a year later to make a presentation to a conference of the builders, and they quickly put me in perspective and said, it's true, we had a lot of physical destruction of buildings, but there's a big difference between what they called irregular housing, which is places like this, cabins, shacks built out in the country, versus, and not built according to building codes, versus offices and apartments that were built according to code. If you're built according to code, those buildings withstood the winds much better. So right away, you can see we had the damage was felt differentially between the haves and the have-nots. Okay, a few more photos to show you how destructive it was. Everything's blown down. Now, so again, this was the longest outage in American history. Looking at my 9 months worth of outage. And a month ago or so, we were watching the news stories from Texas. Texas had a grid that went down, a different scenario, just cold weather. It wasn't no high winds. But one of the first things that we heard about was lack of clean water. And I actually said to my contacts in Puerto Rico, I said, this part of the story sounds very familiar, because that surely was an issue in Puerto Rico. When there's no power, you can't pump water. Municipal water systems quickly go offline, and water, clean water, maybe is more important than electricity for public health. It's close, but anyway. And so you had tens of thousands of homes damaged or destroyed. When you flew into San Juan after the fact, you would see vast expanses of blue tarps. People had, the shingles had been torn off the houses, and they would put blue tarps down temporarily to keep the water out. And they ran out of blue tarps. That was an issue by itself at one point. Of course, surface transportation was disrupted. Months later, when I was there, the stoplights still were not working, and so it disrupted surface transportation. And this was part of the reason it took so long to restore service. The crews could not get around easily. People couldn't get to medical services, you know. So there was a human toll, a death toll, which started off, and it took the government a while to get accurate numbers on how many people had been killed, but it turned out it was close to 3,000. And I will say, when I was there for this public collaborative, the first day of the collaborative, the end of the day, we were sitting outside on the veranda of this hotel, and it was done at a nice hotel, and we had sort of it was like a Quaker religious service. People sitting in three circles, one circle inside of another circle inside of another circle, and nobody leading, no ministers, nobody leading the conversation, but it was just an opportunity to get together and share stories of what had happened. And I'll tell you, I was really moved by that, because it turned out that it seemed like everybody in this collaborative had known somebody, had a friend, a family member that had expired, had died because they couldn't refrigerate key life-saving meds, or they had some health issue and they couldn't get to the hospital. So it was a searing experience shared by everyone who was there at the time. I will just leave it at that. Okay, so first order of business was rebuilding the grid. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers got down there, and based on testimony they gave at the Senate Energy Committee in May of 2018, they, at that time, represented that they had almost 80% of the transmission system had been rebuilt, about the same amount of distribution. There were still almost 23,000 customers who were without power. They were mostly in remote areas at the end of distribution circuits. Excuse me. So, because Puerto Rico is broke, their Commonwealth government is broke, is in receivership, is in bankruptcy, and their utility is in bankruptcy. They can't raise money anywhere but at the moment with Uncle Sam, federal Congress. And according to NBC News, tracking these dollar flows has been very difficult in the couple of years I was there. Here I'm relying on a report from NBC News. According to NBC, 42.5 billion was allocated. Of course, allocated versus dispersed is two different things. Less than 14 billion through the end of 2019. And also, excuse me, as of September last year, FEMA had released 9.6 billion for grid rebuilding. So the money has been slow in coming, but it is moving now. So rebuilding the grid, we're still just talking about the engineering part of this equation. A couple of key lessons have been learned. I've got something in my throat. The first most basic lesson is that what we would call the legacy grid in Puerto Rico. When I say legacy grid, Puerto Rico had a grid that was like every other grid in the lower 48, certainly like the grid we have here in Virginia. It was the design dates from the 50s and the 60s, and it's basically designed to distribute power from central stations, massively large generating stations, to distribute power through transmission lines into distribution lines into end-use consumers. The power flows one way. This legacy system in Puerto Rico was, excuse me a minute, was, in retrospect, was particularly vulnerable. And why? It's because, remember that satellite photo when the lights were on, a lot of population center in the north of the island. But guess what? The generating stations that serve that load, most of them are in the south of the island, large central station type generators. So the implication is you're reliant on transmission lines to go over what the Cordilla Central, there's a mountain range through the center of the island. And of course, maybe not of course, but in retrospect, we would say, of course, the storms, which, and I'm going to show you a storm track, the history of storm tracks in a minute. You'll see they tend to approach the island from the southeast, and they traverse to the northwest. That means the high winds come across that Cordilla Central mountain range, and those mountains effectively funnel the high winds onto the transmission towers if they happen to be on the top of the mountain ranges, as they must be if you have to send power over the mountains to get from the south to the north. Okay, and the other thing is, once these transmission towers are down, because they're located in remote areas in the mountains, they're hard to get to. So it takes a long time to fix them. So the legacy grid was not a good solution for Puerto Rico. Much better to rely more on what we call distributed resources. Now, what do I mean by distributed? Distributed are smaller scale generators that can be located closer to the load. We have a growing amount of history, operating experience with them in the lower 48, and particularly under storm conditions, and they have proven very resilient. So in Puerto Rico's case, one of the basic lessons was we need to build a new kind of grid. We need to make greater use of distributed resources, and therefore we need a kind of a grid that can accommodate distributed resources. And I don't want to go too far into this, getting in the weeds, as it were, but I have a couple of slides that will illustrate what I'm talking about here in a minute. So here's the storm track. This does not have the 2017 storms on it, but it shows a lot of history from the 19th century forward, and you see this tendency. There have been a few storms that went almost east to west, but most of them go southeast northwest. So just reinforces that point that there is some history with how storms hit Puerto Rico. Okay, now I said the distributed generators have been very resilient. Here is evidence of some recent major storms on the East Coast or the eastern US. Of course, Hurricane Sandy, we all remember that. I remember being in Arlington. Many of you in the audience probably were. And we lost power for a couple of days, as I recall, a couple of days. And it was inconvenient, but I'm sure it was nothing like what they went through in Puerto Rico. But during that outage period in New York and New Jersey, look at all these facilities that had previously installed distributed generators, which stayed on and were powered, and we're doing fine. So there's some lessons here. Again, Hurricane Harvey recently in 2017 in Texas. There also were examples of distributed power systems. This CHP, which you may see here, the Texas Medical Center, that's combined heat and power, which is a different kind of distributed system. It's a distributed generator as part of it. So there's some lessons here. There's some examples that distributed machines are resilient and make sense. Okay, so if you have a multiplicity, you have several distributed generating sources, you can network them. You can link them together. And then you create something called a microgrid. And this is a technical revolution in the electric utility industry, the advent of microgrids. A microgrid, as the US Department of Energy has defined it, is a group of interconnected loads and distributed resources within clearly defined electrical boundaries that acts as a single controllable entity with respect to the grid. And we can talk about integration, but the point is microgrids are a new promising technology, and they can be deployed by customers, by businesses, by individual. I have a friend in California, a very state-of-the-art kind of a guy, who in effect has a microgrid in his home. Now, you might not call it a microgrid, but technically it has all of these components. It has a smart thermostat. It has water heaters that can be controlled and in effect dispatched against different price regimes. It has batteries, a Tesla battery. It has solar panels. It does not have the diesel generator, but it has all that other stuff. And these things are all integrated through a controller, and they look to the grid like one load. Okay, that's on a very small microgrid, but you can do this. Hospitals, the University of Texas in Austin has one of the most advanced and one of the biggest microgrids. It's a model that's people around the country look at. Princeton University has a microgrid that is also touted a lot of times. And there are growing kinds of applications that represent communities, businesses doing this kind of thing for themselves, okay? But guess what? A utility can do this as well. When a utility does it, it's called a public purpose microgrid. It's something built for a public purpose. And Consolidated Edison Company in Illinois has been an industry leader, not the only utility to do this, but they have been one of the first and been out front in pushing the boundaries and demonstrating some really good innovation, demonstrating how to look at your service territory and how to pinpoint, how to decide where if you can't build a microgrid to support every one of your customers in a large urban distribution system, how do you prioritize things? Well, they've done it by looking at where on their system do they have the weakest operating, where they have the most outages and the most reliability problems. That's one thing to look at. But they also looked at this projected load at risk. They looked at where are there facilities like hospitals, like water treatment plants, like air traffic control centers. Where are there facilities that are critical, that are more critical than other kinds of facilities? And those are the things we're going to target with our microgrid. We're going to build a system so that in extremis, if we have a big problem, the whole grid goes down, these critical facilities will stay up. That's the idea. And so public purpose microgrid, there are examples of them on the lower 48. And of course, Puerto Rico can find out about this and are intrigued. I told you a minute ago, everybody hates everybody hates their utility in Puerto Rico. So hearing about this thing called a public purpose microgrid, I guarantee you there are communities in Puerto Rico that are chomping at the bit to build a little microgrid for their community and basically unplug from that nasty old PREPA. And they're only, they're limited by investment capital, but technically it's a lot of that is doable. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of planning going on in Puerto Rico. So public purpose microgrids. Okay, if you're going to, we're back to the grid here for a minute, this notion, the legacy grid that I said showed its vulnerability during the storms. To build a grid that can really integrate distributed resources, it needs to be able to support two-way power flow. The legacy grid was designed for one-way power flow. And we have learned in the industry, particularly in Hawaii. Hawaii is sometimes, and I recommended Hawaii to my client in some contexts as a model. They are another island system that has deployed a lot of distributed solar. They also were hurt by those oil price increases. They had a system that started off being largely oil fired, and they've had some of the highest rates, electric rates in the US, and people were eager to get away from the utility and put up their own, rooftop solar. And they did. And so there was a learning experience in Hawaii. We used to, when I was still at EEI, we called them, they were on the bleeding edge of change because they learned painfully that their legacy grid couldn't handle it. They got to a tipping point where they had so much solar PV that and of course, Hawaii had a lot of sun. In the middle of the day when the sun is out and all those PV cells are working and you're pumping power, when you have more power coming into your house than you can use, well, it flows back up the line into the grid. And at a certain point, the grid starts to have transformers and whatnot that start to shut down because they're not set up to handle that. And so you have over voltage and under voltage problems. And again, I'm maybe getting too far into this, but the point is you need a new kind of grid. I'm just going to leave it at that. And just let me get to these illustrations to show you what I'm talking about. So here is the traditional, the legacy grid. And you see basically the power flows from the central station, number one. It flows like water downhill. It goes through the switching station, comes down into a local distribution circuits, and it goes to end users, into homes and hospitals and whatever else kind of end use you have. And this is the way we designed things in the 50s and the 60s, and it worked well enough. Set it and forget it was the term that electrical engineers used to use. And the voltage would in the electric industry, well, the electric appliances in your home, even before we get to the digital ones, the computers and the whatnot, the stove and the lights and the radios, they're all designed to work within a certain pretty narrowly defined range of frequencies and voltages. And they will tolerate a little bit of variation, but not much. So in this legacy setup, the voltages actually typically would decline. If you measured the voltages at 4 or 6, about midway on this slide, versus down here at 9 somewhere, they would not be the same voltages. They'd be a little higher upstream, a little lower downstream, but you would set all of this so that the lowest voltage at the bottom end of the circuit was still within an acceptable range, okay? That's set it and forget it, that's the legacy. Well, and that's of course without stuff coming from the other end. Well, here's a more future-oriented view of this what they call integrated grid. What's it integrating? It's integrating. We still have some central station sources, but we also now have distributed sources that are located on rooftops and on businesses deep in the distribution system. So the implication is that this kind of a grid has to be more dynamic. It has to be able to manage the voltages and has to respond when the sun is out or when the sun is not out. Makes a big difference on how much voltage you're going to get, and it has to be able to adjust. And so it requires additional sensors and communications and controls. It's sort of the legacy grid with a lot of other technologies and functionality overlain on top of it. And that's where we're headed. I think that's where we're headed in the industry. Not at the same rate everywhere, for sure, but I think this is generally a vision of the future. This is where we're headed. Certainly, Hawaii is way, way along the road. In California, they're pretty far along. Other states like Minnesota and Illinois are somewhere between. There's a continuum of development. They're along the road. Anyway, this is where things are moving to. Okay, now, so Puerto Rico has looked at this and said, yeah, that's what we want. And let's design that and build it and go for it. And let's try to use that federal money because nobody else is going to give us any investment capital right away. Okay, but so we have two things going on here. We have this movement toward distributed resources, some of which are renewable. I've been talking about rooftop solar, but some of which can be gas-fired. In my neighborhood in Arlington, we have a lot of these gas-fired generating backup generators, which are very efficient and very convenient, and they're automated such that if the grid goes down, these things are tied into the gas lines, and they will kick on automatically, and they'll keep running and keep you powered, and they'll automatically shut off. They're very nice. Anyway, so we're building a grid that can handle distributed resources. Well, but we also know that we live in a time of climate change, and we have a new administration that has, wants to talk about this and wants to do something about it and wants to decarbonize the grid and do it quickly. And that's the key here. In Puerto Rico, they want to do it quickly. They have passed legislation in 2019 to set some very aggressive goals for renewable resources on the grid. 40% on or before 2025. That's really coming up fast. And look at this. Today, or a year ago, only about 2.5% of the kilowatt hours flowing across the grid in Puerto Rico were from renewable resources. So that says to me, number one, they're probably not going to make these legislated dates. Number one, that's probably not realistic. But number two, to get even close to it, they can't rely on rooftop solar distributed. They have to build utility scale renewables. Okay, big fields of PV or big fields of wind turbines. That's what we've done in the lower 48, and that's a way to decarbonize in a hurry. Now, to say it's utility scale is not to say the utility has to do it. Utility can buy it, can get a third party a contract, a long-term contract, and that's how we've built our wind, a lot of wind in the US. But my point is here that there's a tension between wanting to have renewable resources and wanting to have distributed resources. Having near-term mandates for renewables is going to make us go to utility scale, big projects. Okay, that's my point here. So let me keep going. So bankruptcy. So we've been rebuilding the grid, building a new kind of grid because of the lessons we learned. That's all good, but we have some financial problems here. I said at the very beginning, that throughout most of its history, PREPA did not have any regulator looking over its shoulder. It was directly subject to influence by the government. And you may be shocked to hear this, but in Puerto Rico, and I dare say elsewhere in the US, politicians frequently take a short-term view of issues. They tend to kick the can down you've heard that expression, kick the can down the road. They won't deal with the hard problems. They take short-term, what is easiest politically in the short term. And that is exactly what happened in Puerto Rico. And that's what I think that is what led to the bankruptcy. So the Puerto Rico utility filed for bankruptcy in July of 2017, at which time they had I'm showing a couple of key financial ratios here. Total debt to total assets for PREPA in July 2017 was 0.91. The debt was 91% of their value of their assets, and it was even over 100% if you counted in the value of unfunded pension liabilities. Remember, I said they had a lot of feather bedding. They had a lot of people who were kind of treating the utility as the employer of last resort, and they've got pension rights, and it's politically difficult to default or to ignore those pension rights. So you add those up, they're way underwater for debt. By basis of comparison, a comparable ratio for a municipal in the lower 48, a municipal in Virginia, for example, now is about 0.56 on average. This data, these numbers come from the American Public Power Association, which surveys its members. And so that is a national estimate. And it just shows you how far off the tracks and how far unsustainable, how deep their debt problem is. Okay, and again, why did this happen? I think, and undoubtedly several factors came together. The biggest factor, I think, was the fact that they didn't have any regulatory oversight for most of its life, and they were doing what was short-term expedient, for the government. A key function of regulators in the lower 48 is to do two things: to regulate the rates that the utility charges, but to regulate the capital structure, to oversee how much debt they're raising. And how much of what kind in Virginia, every time Virginia Dominion Virginia wants to raise money to sell bonds or to sell stock, they have to get approval from the commission, and the commission is paying attention to their credit ratings. A little debt is appropriate in the utility industry. Debt is the lifeblood of the industry, because I think I've heard it once said that something as much as 2/3 of all the money that has been raised historically on the New York Stock Exchange has been raised by electric utilities to build our power system. Electric utilities are about the most capital-intensive business in our economy. So they have to raise capital. But for that reason, it's vital that they preserve their credit rating, because if you can't get the money from private investors, where you're going to get the money? You may know that our governments tend to be I wouldn't say insolvent, but we're running deficits all over the place. You can't get the money from the taxpayer generally. We need to be able to raise private money. Okay, so they're in trouble. They file in 2017, and the Obama administration saw this coming and got some federal legislation passed, the PROMESA, Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, to provide a procedure for dealing with this. for working their way out of insolvency, negotiating with bondholders, getting a deal, and then honoring it. And of course, the court of jurisdiction here is the U.S. District Court in Puerto Rico. Okay, so we have a solution. And here, before we get to the solution, here I thought this was relevant to look at this. Remember, they have an oil-fired system, and world oil prices have been quite variable, and they have risen quite a bit since the early 2000s. Now, world oil prices, I don't think, not since when I first got into the energy, started a career in energy, actually, the world oil markets had been cornered by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And many of you on the audience are probably old enough to remember in 1973, we had the first oil embargo, and suddenly gasoline prices went through the roof. And then again in 79. Since then, I don't follow the oil markets, I don't have occasion to, but I don't think that they are manipulated the way they used to be. I think these price movements that we see here charted are sort of a free market response, the interaction of supply and demand. And so, again, this is part of why Puerto Rico got into trouble. Their oil prices went up starting, you see, oil prices really spiked in 2008, and I'm not sure why. Remember, that was the financial beginning of the recession in the U.S. This is a world price movement, so I'm not sure. I looked on the internet and didn't get a definitive answer. Strong demand with stagnating world supply was the summation that I saw. But I know one other factor. In what happened in 2011? Look at 2011 was just about when there was a second spike, rapid run up. What happened in 2011? There was the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster, where you had a tidal wave come in and take off the nuclear plant. And I think subsequently most of the nukes in Japan were shut down. And of course, what did they do? They had to burn oil or LNG, liquefied natural gas. I think that was a big part of that second spike in oil prices. But whatever the reason, oil prices spiked. They didn't raise rates to recover costs, which is what we did everywhere else that was burning oil in the US. And as a result, they have a problem. And what do? They sold debt. They raised bonds to pay. They incurred long-term debt to pay for short-term price increases, and that is imprudent, as we'd say in the utility industry. Very imprudent. Okay, so they have a problem. They negotiated a first debt restructuring agreement in 2017, which was scuttled by the board. That's not the board of the utility, that's the board of the financial oversight group that was set up pursuant to that federal law that the Obama administration got passed. I don't remember exactly why it was scuttled. It was just politically unacceptable and couldn't get agreement. So there was a second agreement negotiated in 2019. And they had two prices they negotiated with bondholders. The bondholders had agreed this 67.5 cents per dollar on the dollar. That's almost a 1/3% reduction in the debt. The bondholders had taken a tremendous hit there, a tremendous haircut, as we would say in the utility industry. And they had a schedule of rate increases that would recover that debt over a period of many years. Well, that was not, that created a political firestorm. And you'll see this quote from somebody at the American Enterprise Institute. Political leaders, including then Governor Wanda Vasquez and the Senate President Thomas Rivera Schatz, have all but vetoed the proposed deal and taken an increasingly populist stance against debt repayment. Well, you know, fine, you're being political and you're doing what's easy with the voters, but this financial problem has not been resolved because of the lack of leadership. My opinion, my perspective. And you'll see here that most recently, in January of this year, the new governor is asking for equality in terms of how this federal money is dispersed. He wants it dispersed without the kinds of controls and oversight like it was dispersed in Texas and Florida. Well, you can just think for yourself whether equality is appropriate given the history in Puerto Rico of corruption and the unwillingness to repay debt. So anyway, I'll leave that. Okay, so we're in the context of institutional reform here. And we've said at the beginning, the utility was the first and most important institution that was not working well. They hadn't been regulated for most of their history. Starting in 2014, the Commonwealth passed legislation that authorized a Puerto Rican Energy Commission. And one of the first things the commission did was do a rate case. That's what they're supposed to do, regulate rates. So you need to get accounting cost data together and allocate it and do all kinds of things that you do in cost of service regulation and figure out what rates should be to recover costs that were prudently incurred. And so one of the first things I did when I started working for my Puerto Rican client was I read the rate case finding, and it was astounding to me. They started off saying the culture and practices rising from 75 years of monopoly status, subject to continuous and short-sighted political interference, but with no oversight by an objective, professional, apolitical commission. That's what we're dealing with, and we find that as a result, we have damage in the form of a deep and deteriorated physical system, demoralized workers, hesitant lenders, skeptical renewable energy developers, and suffering consumers. It's a hell of a mess. Okay, developing a regulatory, for the commission. So the point is, this hole that they dug themselves was the result of a lack of regulatory oversight. So implementing effective regulatory oversight was a problem, is a problem. We'll come back to it in a minute. So there is a master plan, there is a vision for restructuring PREPA. And I got this directly from a good friend, a colleague, the guy that hired me at EEI way back when, who now is vice chair of the board of that utility. He, like me, is a retired guy, but and like me, I was working in Puerto Rico not to make the money, but really as a public service. I worked for a very low rate of compensation, and my friend David Owens is, I'm sure, doing the same thing. He's not doing it for the money. He wants to give back, and he's in a position where his skills and knowledge can be put to good use, trying to help sort things out. Anyway, the point is, I got this straight from the horse's mouth. This is inside poop about how they're going to restructure the utility. They're going to break it into three pieces that's going to be overseen by a holding company, a holdco. So they'll have a separate company that will run the T&D, the transmission and distribution system. That company is called LUMA. They're a third-party company with a long-term contract. The utility will continue to own the T&D assets because they have to do that to qualify for FEMA funding. If the federal government is going to put money into Puerto Rico, they're not going to give any federal dollars to third-party operators, no matter how qualified and how good. Has to remain in government ownership. Okay. So they have a grid co, they'll have a genco, a generating company. Same idea, a third party that will have a long-term contract to operate the generating fleet. They'll have a third company, a servco, that will basically handle the customer interface, that will do billings. When you call for service, that's who you'll deal with. And so there will be an emphasis on giving good, responsive customer service, okay, and a holding company. We're getting close to the end. The other piece of this institutional transformation challenge is developing effective regulatory oversight. And that, again, that was what I was sort of engaged to help think through how to do at the from the beginning. This Energy Bureau was authorized in 2014. They still have the issue of hiring a key staff, they can't, in order to function well. I've seen, when I've been down there to testify on their integrated resource plan about a year ago, and the commissioners are good. They're doing a good job. They're as impressive as regulators in Virginia, for example. They're smart lawyers, and some have a technical background, but they need technical staff. They need some key technical staff to be able to function. And I think that they haven't filled that void yet. A year ago, when I was there testifying, they had hired consultants to do what key staff would otherwise be doing. And so the commission and the staff need to really learn cost of service rate making, which is a whole institution. It's like learning accounting sort of from the beginning. How do they do it in the utility world? What is the test year, and how do you allocate the costs and functionalize them and all this stuff? There's a well-defined procedure that they need to learn how to do. Getting the utility to pay attention. That may not be self-evident, but you have a utility. I saw this firsthand. You have a utility that, as I said, for most of its operating existence, didn't have regulatory oversight, and they were not eager, and they were not willing to submit. Frankly, they found all kinds of excuses not to do what the commission told them to do, and the easiest excuse was that they're in bankruptcy, and there is another entity, this PROMESA board, that they have to report to. And they took the view that the commission doesn't have jurisdiction right now. And so I think they're probably Financial Oversight Board. They need to execute a memo of understanding, and they need to define their respective roles and responsibilities. And they didn't follow my good advice there, so they still probably have some issues there. The last thing here is developing an integrated resource plan. This is the other way that regulators in Virginia or anywhere else in the country, part of how they perform their oversight is they oversee. The utility has the lead in doing resource planning and figuring out what to spend money on to develop new supplies, what to spend money on, and how to, they take the lead, but it's subject to extensive regulatory oversight and public hearings and such. And that was the kind of hearing that I participated in about a year ago, commented on the integrated resource plan. So the commission is learning how to do that. Okay, I'm just gonna mention this briefly, and then we'll get on to some of our questions for discussion. I think I said earlier that the industry is changing, not just in Puerto Rico, it's changing across the country. The technologies are changing, the grid designs are changing. We're moving to decarbonize things. We had an earlier round of restructuring in the late 90s, early 2000s, because some people thought the regulated system was inefficient, and we could do better by going to the market, having market competition. We could have a whole seminar on how that worked out. Did it work? Did it not work? I think it would suffice it to say the results are far from obvious and definitive, and you can argue both sides very easily. But certainly part of that history, we unbundled the regulated utility. What does that mean? We took a utility that was vertically integrated, that owned generating stations, owned transmission lines, owned distribution circuits, owned everything. And we unbundled them. We made them sell off their generators. And as soon as you did that, we implemented non-discriminatory access to make sure the utility could not make use of its control. It could not limit access to the transmission system to exercise some kind of monopoly power. So we're very careful to make sure we had non-discriminatory transmission access. And we implemented in some regions, in this region, we have something called PJM, which runs our transmission system, and 13 states, and coordinates transmission and power supply, and administers a competitive wholesale market. So we pay, here in Virginia, part of what we pay for is power, some of which comes to us from competitive wholesale markets. I think some of it is from PJM, and some of it is from assets that are owned by Dominion Virginia. I think they still own some assets. And in the world that we're living in the lower 48, we have something called the prosumer. What is a prosumer? In the old days, when I started working in the industry, they talked about ratepayers. Ratepayers. Ratepayers were dumb consumers, dumb in the sense that they didn't take too much interest in utility issues. They just paid the bill. The world has changed, and we have a growing number of consumers who have rooftop solar or who have these gas-fired generating plants, their own, and they suddenly are in the position to be suppliers. So they can be suppliers at some times, and they can be consumers at some times. They are they're active. They're becoming active participants in the market, and it's a whole different ballgame for the utility. Utility has to figure out how to work with prosumers. Okay, so we have a lot of change afoot in the lower 48, and as I said, folks in Puerto Rico are watching all this, and they don't like their utility. Utility has got a bad name, and deservedly so, and they want to, so the question becomes, can't we do all this stuff that they're doing in the lower 48? Shouldn't we do that in Puerto Rico? Well, and my client would be asking me that, and I would say, hold off, let's go slow. Some of those things that we did are not applicable. And here's one point of comparison. Look at the differences in scale. The PJM system, which is what I just described, supplies us in the mid-Atlantic. They coordinate the power supply in 13 states and the District of Columbia. In the recent, early in February, I looked at their website. Their forecast peak capacity, peak demand was almost 114,000 megawatts. Look at by comparison, the Puerto Rico system, their peak demand was 2,600 megawatts, and it's probably less than that now because they've been going through a recession, and things are still winding down. They have negative growth in Puerto Rico. So, it doesn't follow that what was smart and cost-effective to do in PJM is smart and cost-effective to do in Puerto Rico. And I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made. So, with that, one more slide I wanted to show you that to me is an example of institutional issues that are unresolved in Puerto Rico. Here are some recent developments that made the news. The New York Power Authority and the utility signed a partnership to implement a 10-year spending plan. New York Power Authority had come in early on in the recovery process to offer some advice, some technical expertise and advice on how to plan a new system, how to rebuild. Okay, that's New York Power Authority. Burns and McDonnell is a big, well-known contractor in the industry. They got a long-term contract to manage the Integrated Resource Plan implementation, and that is being funded by FEMA and the HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And then we have this LUMA contract that was to manage the grid that was awarded by this Public-Private Partnerships Authority, which is an entity created by legislation in Puerto Rico. And finally, we have an integrated resource plan. That's the thing I gave testimony on, which was approved by the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau. Well, notice the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau is at the bottom. You have this Public-Private Partnerships Authority. That's not the Energy Bureau. You have FEMA and HUD, which is giving money and therefore has some say in things. And you have this NIPA involvement. Who's in charge? Who's in charge in Puerto Rico? I think it's a question. And I can tell you that the PREPA is very irritated with this Public-Private Partnerships Authority. And, you know, from my point of view, and my advice to my client was, look, in the lower 48, the way we rationalize this, the way we organize things, the regulator needs to be in charge of all of this kind of stuff. The regulator, the State Regulatory Commission, they operate pursuant to authorities that are granted them by the legislature, the state legislature. They control rates. And if you control rates, that's the important stuff. Any of these other players that NIPA, FEMA, and HUD, the Partnerships Authority, they can do stuff and maybe incur costs. The money has to be recovered in rates, and that's who's Puerto Rico Energy Bureau should be in charge of that. So I'm going to leave this. I'm just raising, to my mind, this is an example of a sort of a bifurcated or a fractured line of authority. This is not good. This is not good for investors. To an investor, this sounds muddled. This sounds like risk. This is this is uncertainty and risky. I would put my money somewhere else where I know who's in charge. So I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, my conclusions. I hope I have demonstrated to you that reconstruction in Puerto Rico is going to involve a lot more than just rebuilding the electric grid. It involves developing or redeveloping a number of these key institutions. And to my mind, this previous slide about who's in charge reflects some significant unresolved institutional issues about who's in charge and how is planning going to proceed in an orderly way. The other thing, given the politics, and I alluded to this briefly, unwillingness to repay debt. For the moment, Puerto Rico is completely dependent on federal largesse. But that can't go on forever. Puerto Rico needs to get to a point where they build and operate a power supply system that they can afford. I think that's self-evident, but they're not there yet. A final conclusion. This reflects maybe my biases, having worked for the utility industry, but I really think a service-oriented utility in Puerto Rico has a critical role to play. I emphasize service-oriented because the legacy of PREPA was not service. They were not a service-oriented utility. They did not exist, to provide service to the public. They existed really for their own benefit, for the employment they provided and whatever. You need a service-oriented utility, but once you have changed the culture and reorganized the utility so it is truly service-oriented, they are key to serving the public, to managing this transition to a new kind of a grid, to building a low carbon power system. You really can't do it without a utility, a public utility. So that's my take on the thing at the end. So here are some questions for discussion. And Terry, if you're listening, this might be a good time to look at some of, if you've got any questions posed in the Q&A box, we might want to consider them, entertain them.
Well, we just want to show some, you should stop sharing because we want to,
okay, let me
to talk about some upcoming events and
you want to do that before we take any questions on this?
yeah, let me share this. Bam. Sorry. Not advancing. Okay, so just we'll talk briefly about the events that are coming up. On April 5th, we have the history and governance of college basketball, insights on 2021 Final Four. It's appropriate for because it's right after the the March Madness and the NCAA tournament. Also on April 19th, we have pre-Earth Day. We have we document on the lifelong battle on evolutionary science. This is of the life of Pierre Desjardins and his groundbreaking discoveries in evolutionary science. And with that, let me go back and then let me stop sharing. Sorry. And get me on. One of the questions is, a few questions. There was FEMA money, and it was in the beginning. It was only used to repair, and has that been changed? That they're building new grids or new utilities, whatever, and new equipment.
Yeah, I think it has been changed. I'm not totally up to speed on the final resolution, but it was an issue. Particularly with the Army Corps. The Army Corps were the first feds in there, and their mission, I think by statute, was to rebuild what was there before. And so they had very limited ability to build anything new. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer, but I think the guts of the system, the stringing the wires and the poles, that's a sort of an essential facility that you need whether you're building a legacy system or building a new system. So I always considered that a large part of what the Army Corps did was going to be useful. The FEMA money, that's a relevant question, and I'm not sure exactly. I think there was some adjustment in the authorization to allow them to build a new kind of design, but I would have to check on
that. Someone also asked, what is the difference between transmission and distribution?
Okay, transmission, or think of big big wires versus little wires. Transmission is high voltage circuits. In the way the system was originally developed, we had these big generators, big generating stations, hundreds of megawatts worth of generating capacity that would pump their power across states, from state to state, and so to distribute it, to transmit it at long distances, you use big wires at high voltage because that's more efficient. And then you step it down to get into the distribution system. Distribution system is the local delivery system. And there the wires are smaller, the voltages are lower, and it's a question of scale. So.
Yeah, and while there are other island nations, someone asked if there's other island nations, how are they addressing the same kind of problems regarding electric grids? Are they doing things differently, or are they just as bad?
Well, as I said, Hawaii is a leader in developing this modern grid. They've had to be, and they had a couple of years back now. They had so because they've had to implement or design and build this new kind of integrated grid. They also had to pioneer how to plan it and manage the development of it. And they have, and they had a very interesting roadmap a couple of years ago that they already know. So Hawaii is a place to look. Other island nations, I'm not familiar with all of them, of course, probably not any farther along. I will tell you one very interesting, Australia is not an island. They are self-contained continent, but last year, there was a proposal that I read about to really develop utility scale PV. I mean, in really big numbers. Australia has a lot of sunlight. You can imagine. It has, I don't know what the population of Australia is, but it has the potential to develop photovoltaic capacity well beyond what they need in Australia. And so there was an investor group that was looking at the potential to develop a multi-billion dollar, a 10 billion, a project, in the tens of billions to deploy vast photovoltaic fields and make all this power and distribute it via undersea cables to regional energy markets. They wouldn't even use the power in Australia. And I didn't have to think about that very long. And I thought, is that economic? How could you, undersea cables? That's the most expensive way so I just asked the question, well, you should look at the economics of taking that DC power and converting it into hydrogen via electrolysis. And you can ship BTUs as hydrogen, maybe do it more cheaply than to use anyway. That's not really the modern grid. Right. That's a whole different thing. So I didn't answer beyond Hawaii. I don't have a good on-point answer, but Hawaii is definitely state of the art, I would say.
Right. Can you speak to well, we have somebody who has family in Puerto Rico. Now, can you speak to talk about the proliferation of household diesel generators and the impact of that, on, I guess, the environment?
Well, I'm sure it's not good. Dirty diesel. So I think there are vendors, if I don't know the cost comparisons, but I'm sure there are, and some of that HUD money is available for rooftop solar deployment. So right. Before you buy a diesel, I would see, look, there may be sources of financing to go with PV, and that would surely be better from an air quality point of view.
Yeah, I think the other answer to this one, not quite sure, but what's the advantage, disadvantage for Puerto Rico to become a U.S. state? I mean, as far as their power problems, is it going to hurt efforts, or are they?
I don't think there's an obvious building a reliable grid point of view. I mean, they're already a U.S. protectorate, and they're already getting federal money. Maybe there's an advantage if you're a state and you're represented in the Congress and in the U.S. Senate. Maybe you have a little more say over things. But and obviously, Democrats in Washington, for the same reason they'd love to have D.C. as a state, they'd probably love to have Puerto Rico as a state. Or change the balance of power a little further in the Senate. But
yeah, the other one is like, no, we're not running at that. What do you estimate is the probability or a successful outcome in Puerto Rico, and what's the timeline? When do you think that might happen? Or is it happening now?
Well, it's not, those issues are not all resolved yet. I know that my friend in PREPA, his perspective is that one of the most critical things, near-term priorities, is to demonstrate to industrial customers that somebody competent is in charge. They're going to fix the grid so that it is reliable, so that a business can rely on it. And because I mentioned in my talk that I sometimes used to point to Hawaii as a model for Puerto Rico. And my Puerto Rico clients never liked that, because they would say, our economy is much more diversified. The Hawaiian economy, I'm sure, is all about travel and vacation, travel and leisure, hotels and going to the beach. In Hawaii, they have, or used to have, a significant industrial component to their GDP, to their local economy. Why? Because the US Congress created tax incentives for people to locate manufacturing in Puerto Rico. If you built stuff in Puerto Rico, you didn't pay, or you paid a reduced federal tax on your products. And as a result, it was the case that most of our pharmaceutical manufacturing capability was located in Puerto Rico, both pharmaceuticals and medical device manufacturing. Those tax incentives were removed some years ago now, and I heard the story about why. Because it, from my point of view, it clearly hurt the economy in Puerto Rico, made it less attractive to locate manufacturing there. And as I heard it, it was the result of a view by Puerto Ricans who were favoring statehood, that if they're going to become a state, they can't have any kind of differential favorable tax treatment. They have to be like everybody else. Well, okay, maybe that's a downside to being a state. You lose that, but they lost those tax incentives. Nevertheless, they have a lot of manufacturing capacity that's already been invested in Puerto Rico, and they want to keep them. They want to maintain those. They don't want those folks to leave. So my friend's point to me was, our priority should be to demonstrate reliable power supply to those guys, so they don't feel they need to leave. So
can you?
What's the timeline? The question was the timeline. I think we're talking, to be realistic, I think we're talking probably years to, hopefully just a couple of years to strengthen the grid and have a reliable, resilient power supply. That is probably a matter of years. Some of these institutional issues are probably decades long. Certainly the financial problems are going to take decades to unwind and to dig out. But clearly the priority, the issue, I mean, the socioeconomic issue in Puerto Rico is the economy. They need to get back to the growth track.
Yeah, I've got a couple more questions to try to get to. I don't know if you can you comment on the issues in Texas regarding power? Faces winter. So
what about the issues in Texas? Well,
the power problems in Texas, you know.
Yeah. And of course, a big cause for the problem in Texas was they had this cold that was not completely. It's not true to say they'd never had this kind of problem before, but they don't have it regular. They hadn't had it frequent. They don't have those kind of cold temperatures regularly enough that the generators have made the investment to winterize their equipment. That was the first, the prime cause of that was this cold snap and the fact that their equipment wasn't winterized. So I think there are a couple of issues in Puerto Rico, in Texas. Of course, Texas is a state unto itself, a state that likes to think of itself as a nation unto itself. They don't want to be interconnected electrically with the rest of the country. They don't want to be subject to FERC, to federal energy, to the oversight by federal regulators. And as a result, when they have a problem, they have less ability to import power from outside of Texas, and as was pointed out in a webinar that I was back to Rutgers, I'll say another ad for Rutgers. Rutgers had a very good webinar last week on this lessons from Texas. And one of the points was that Texas hasn't developed much demand side capability. The homes are not even minimally weatherized. They don't have much ability to shed load if they have to. When the prices go up, they don't have responsive load. So there are a lot of things of that kind that can be done to mitigate. If they had the same problem, it would mitigate everything. My own view before the webinar was that it was at least partly the result of flawed market design. They have competitive wholesale markets in Texas. They are energy only markets, meaning they rely on the price of the instantaneous price of electricity to provide the incentive for new investment in new generation when they need it. And we have had a learning curve about this on the West Coast and on the East Coast. And I think certainly on the East Coast, I have to check in California, but I think the experience elsewhere has been that an energy-only market is not good enough by itself. You need certainly this PJM, the kind of markets they run, they have a capacity market in addition to an energy market to ensure that we have enough generating capacity. They procure generating capacity separately, and so I think I think it's worth looking at whether that wouldn't be an appropriate thing to do in Texas. Have a capacity market, and then if you have a capacity market as an eligibility criterion, in order to be eligible to participate in the market, you need to do what? You need to weatherize your damn generators so that you're ready. Right. Even if that once in 100 years cold snap, or it's not once in 100, once in 20 years. So yeah.
Regarding the weathers, and one person question is that especially for alternative energy sources, how resilient are things like solar panels and wind generators to changes in the weather, like a hurricane, or changes in the weather, or just like
they can.
How resilient are they to?
Yeah, they can be. They certainly can be destroyed, and nothing is impervious if you have bad enough weather, But I would say it's also fair to say that renewable resources are not any more vulnerable to weather-related disruptions than fossil. The first thing that happened, virtually the first thing that happened after the storms in Puerto Rico, that week, my client and I would talk. Immediately, I couldn't connect with him because of cell phone was disrupted. But when I could get him on the phone, the very first thing he wanted me to do was to do research on minimal configuration, minimal cost PV systems that could be used to do what? Could be used to charge cell phones. Keeping your cell phone live was one of the first highest priorities for folks in Puerto Rico. And so, they didn't want a gas-fired generator. They wanted PV. So I think,
Yeah, I think we're getting down to the last.
and then the last, okay.
434. Yeah. I mean, when the last question is like, what is there's a difference between a prosumer and
And
a consumer?
Okay, a consumer is just a recipient, is just a user of power. That's a consumer. A prosumer can be a supplier, can be a provider. The pro is provider. At certain times you can be a provider, and certain times you can be a consumer.
Yeah, especially with solar panels, you could put power out on the grid.
That's right. That's right.
During certain periods, you know.
That's right. Exactly.
And, well, let everybody know that the very interesting presentation, and we got a lot of comments back that yeah, they like that. So Q&A, no, chat is open. So if you want to put some some appreciation to Eric for to
accolades. Yeah, let's write in some accolades.
Accolades. Yes, we want some accolades.